Hello and welcome to Lecture 1 of International Econ and Finance. It's Econ 3210. This is going to be the first lecture, but before we get into the lecture, I wanted to talk briefly about the course and set some expectations. This course, which is being administered online, is going to focus probably 2/3 to 3/4 of the course on economics and topics related to what is covered in the book. That being said, you are expected to read the chapters in the book, and I've outlined on Canvas which chapters need to be read by when, so you can stay on track. The quizzes will be related to the readings. The lectures are meant to be a supplement to the readings and hopefully will help to solidify some of the concepts that are found in the book. In addition to the readings and the quizzes and the lectures, I have at least one guest lecturer who will be presenting on a topic related to international trade and the environment, as well as there will likely be a few other additional items. The last quarter of the course will be focusing on some international finance topics, and we'll have a project where we'll get to do an international valuation. So as I mentioned in the other video introduction for this course, I'm available for my office hours. Please feel free to call me or email me. If my office hours don't work for you, please email me and propose another meeting time. I'm pretty flexible. So with that, let's get into Lecture 1, which is International Economics is Different. This is the introduction from the book about how international economics is different than domestic economics. And we'll cover a few of those items here in this lecture. So let's go ahead and get started. So the question is, what is a nation? So nations are not like regions or families that typically reside within a country. Nations are sovereign. So what does that mean? No central court can enforce its will on a nation with a global police force. So as a result, a nation often ignores the interests of other nations, of other foreigners. They are sovereign, which means that they are in and of themselves in charge of themselves. Nobody else is in charge of them. A nation can have its own currency, its own barriers to trading with foreigners, its own government, taxation and spending, and its own laws of citizenship and residency. And so that is a big part of why international economics is a branch of economics. It's because a nation has these rights that cannot be violated by other nations. So the first chapter of the book gives 4 different controversies that are international in nature and are illustrations of how international economics can play a part in decision-making processes for us as business professionals. So one of the controversies that is covered in the first chapter is immigration. So I thought we could cover it here in this first lecture. About 230 million people, or 3% of the world's population, live outside of their country of birth. Myself, I've spent about 5 years outside of the country, going to school and working. I lived in Scotland, as well as, in addition to Scotland, I lived in England. I spent about 4 years in England, where I worked on my PhD and also taught at the university there. And so I was one of these 3% of the people that live outside of our home country. So for most industrialized countries, Japan is an exception to this, but for most industrialized countries, the percentage of the country's population that is foreign born is high, higher than this 3%. As a matter of fact, I believe in the US it's around 13%. So about 13% of our population is from another country. And many of the foreign born are illegal immigrants. About 1/4 of the immigrants, the total foreign-born people living within the United States, are illegal immigrants, and that can pose some issues. So the nice thing about economics is it gives us a way of talking about topics that can be very emotional, and people have very heated discussions, as evidenced by the 2016 election cycle with President Trump's efforts there. But we can step back, we can step away from political party lines, we can step away from other polarizing and controversial approaches, and we can look at it a little bit more dispassionately. That's economics gives us a framework in which we can look at some of these problems from an economy standpoint. So immigration policies are put in place to reduce and restrict immigration. We see that worldwide. Some countries are more strict with their immigration policies and some are more open. Some of the opponents of immigration stress a range of problems that they see arise from immigration. And here are a few of the problems. Number one, they say that there are general losses to the economy. Two, they highlight the fiscal burden from immigrants' use of government services, such as healthcare and schooling. Also, there's often cited a slow integration of immigrants into the new national culture, their values and language, and the requirement of posting signs and other things in the immigrants' language so that they can understand what's going on. Also, they cite a potential of increased crime. And there are links of some immigrants to terrorism. So these are all some negative things that opponents of immigration will cite as problems and reasons why we should stop immigration in countries. So how much harm do immigrants really do to the economies of the countries they move into? And this has been an area of study. We've got a large amount of research that has been done on this. So here's what's been found. Job seeking brings net economic benefits, not only to the immigrants, but to the receiving country overall. And there are many evidence of this. Empirically, we can show this to be true. The winners include the firms that employ the immigrants and the consumers who buy the products from those firms. Typically, the labor cost for those firms will be less, which means that they can pass on the savings to consumers. So there are some winners to immigration. The group that loses are the workers who compete with the immigrants for jobs. And you can hear, and there are real life stories of people who have lost their jobs to immigrants. Now, the book highlights that most of these jobs are the lower paying jobs. And in many instances, I know a business owner here in the southern Utah area who owns some hotels, and they've had a really difficult time finding native-born Americans to fill some of the jobs that they need done. And so immigrants have been a very important part of their hiring and their employee workforce, and has made a big difference. So while some Americans that were born here have lost their jobs towards as a result of immigration, what we found when we put all of this together, the net effect is positive. So there are some obviously winners and some losers, but the winners win more than the losers lose. And as a nation, it's been proven that immigration brings more net economic benefits as a result. And so that, again, these are controversies that can be looked at by way of our international economics. And so this course will introduce many, many topics and many ways of looking at things, but it'll give us a better framework to make decisions and not just give in to the emotion that we hear out there in the news. Okay, just a couple of more slides on economics and the nation state. So the fact that nations have their sovereignty, their separate interests, and their separate policies means that nobody is in charge of the world economy. There's not one central body that's governing the entire world economy. It's nation versus nation, sovereignty versus sovereignty. So among the most important policies that each country can manipulate separately are policies towards international movement of resources, government taxation and spending, and money and exchange rates. And so we see this most recently. There's been some trade wars. A lot of news is found out there regarding the US and China trade talks and the trade war that's going on there. And so each country has a right to set their own policies. And some of those policies can be in direct contradiction to each other. And so they have to find a way to work around that. Finally, some of there are limitations in international factor mobility. What I mean by factors, land, labor, and capital are factors in an economy. Traditional economics, which just looks domestically, land, labor, and capital are easy to move. There are no limitations, or at least we assume no limitations on labor and capital movement within a country. But when we look internationally, there are some limitations. There are limitations to labor and capital movement, especially land. Unless there's a war and another nation takes over the land, there's no movement of land. So this labor and capital and the limitations that are set do affect the economies. And as we look at international economics, we discuss these issues. Also, there are different fiscal policies between nations, public spending, power to tax, and the power to regulate. Each sovereign nation has those rights, and their approaches can affect international investment and whether or not foreign monies and labor can come into the country and how they're taxed. Also, and this is one of the ones that most people would think of when dealing with international economics, is that there are different monetary systems and different currencies. So the value of one money relative to another currency can change. You know, the US dollar versus the British pound. I lived in the UK for a good number of years. The first time I lived in the UK, it was about $1.85 for every British pound. So that was the exchange rate. In order to get one British pound, it cost $1.85. The most recent time when I left the UK, it was $1.35 per British pound. And so the value of money relative to another currency does change. And so all of these things affect our decision-making within business. And so it's important to understand some of these key concepts so that we can include them in our decision-making process. I hope this is a helpful introduction, and we will dive more deeply into some of these issues throughout the coming chapters. Thank you very much.